Mr. President, distinguished members of the Court, it is a privilege to appear before you on behalf of the Gambia. For decades, Myanmar built a discriminatory state system that denationalized the Rohingya, suppressed births and marriages, and made life impossible through segregation, confinement, and deprivation. That system did not arise by accident. It was designed to reduce the Rohingya's population in Arakan state and ultimately facilitate their destruction as a group. As Raphael Lemkin explained, genocide is a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The objectives of such a plan would be disintegration of the political and social institutions of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of the national group, and the destruction of the personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of the individuals belonging to such groups. That is precisely what Myanmar has done to the Rohingya. I will show that Myanmar built and then tightened a comprehensive, legal, administrative, and coercive system to reduce and eliminate the Rohingya in Rakhine State. I will highlight 5 steps in that system. First, in the years following independence, Myanmar recognized the Rohingya as citizens, office holders, and participants in public life. Second, after the 1962 military coup, the state recast the nation along racial lines, culminating in the 1982 citizenship law, which excluded the Rohingya from the so-called national races and laid the legal groundwork for mass denationalization. Third, the 1982 law was implemented to strip the Rohingya of their rights through discriminatory registration, arbitrary decision-making, and violent citizenship verification campaigns, expelling hundreds of thousands of Rohingya from Myanmar. Fourth, from 1993 onward, Myanmar sought to suppress Rohingya births and family life through marriage permits, child limits, and denial of birth registration. Fifth, beginning in 1997, Myanmar segregated and confined the Rohingya in camps and ghettos, severely restricted movement, and deprived them of food and health care. As the UN fact-finding mission observed, taken together, these discriminatory policies indicate Myanmar's genocidal intent. Mr. President, Myanmar denies the Rohingya's very existence as a constituent group of its nation. It has steadfastly refused to refer to them by name throughout the many years of this proceeding. That is consistent with a 1993 statement by its permanent mission to the United Nations. I quote, "The so-called Rohingya never belonged to the national races or national racial groups of Myanmar. The Rohingya do not exist in Myanmar, either historically, politically, or legally, nor do they in any way represent any segment of the population in Myanmar, including those professing the Islamic faith." But as Mr. Suleiman made clear this morning, the historical record shows otherwise. Myanmar's first Prime Minister stated in 1954 that, quote, "Located to the southwest of the Union, Burma, is Rakhine. There are 2 townships there, Mang Dao and Butidao. The majority of the nationals residing in those townships are Rohingya, who are Muslims." The Rohingya were an integral part of Burmese society. Accordingly, 2 Rohingya served on the country's first governing body, the Constituent Assembly, in 1947. In the photo on the screen, you see Rohingya leader Mr. Gaffa with Burma's Prime Minister U Nu and Burma's founding father, Mr. Aung San. Documentation collected by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on its online exhibition entitled Burma's Path to Genocide reflects the integration of the Rohingya in Burmese public life. The Rohingya held elected office, taught in schools, served as police officers, judges, doctors, and worked as farmers and fishers. In this 1950s photo before you now, the Rohingya Students Association of Rangoon University appears with Mr. Rashid, a cabinet minister and founding father of Burma. In the next, you see Irshad, now over 100 years old and living in a refugee camp in Bangladesh. He served as a Rohingya radio broadcaster in the 1960s, when Burma Broadcasting Services provided Rohingya language programming alongside airtime for other ethnic groups. And in the next, you see examples of national registration cards that the Rohingya held, just like other nationals. As Rohingya National Member of Parliament Yu Kwa Min explains, holders of those cards had the right to possess immovable properties, the right to public jobs, insurance, social security, and professional education. He also recounts how Rohingya representatives were invited to Union Day celebrations as part of the union races. In sum, the Rohingya community had a recognized place in Myanmar's post-independence nationhood. The UN fact-finding mission confirms that, quote, most Muslims who then lived in what currently constitutes Rakhine State were therefore included, whether their ancestry could be traced to pre-colonial times or whether they were colonial-era migrants from the region. The exclusion of the Rohingya from the Burmese society began after the 1962 military coup. As Professor Cheeseman, director of the Myanmar Research Center at the Australian National University, explains, at that time, the concept of national races, Tainyintha in Burmese, assumed an unprecedented place in state lexicon, and thereafter in the state-building program. General Ne Win's regime began to construct a vision for a utopian Burmese society defined by a unified set of national races. Professor Cheeseman chronicles the various books on national races that were published by General Ne Win's political party in the 1960s, and how following the return of his military regime in 1988, national races were invoked on every broadcast, publication, and at every major event. A few days before the promulgation of the 1982 citizenship law, General Ne Win declared, I quote, racially, only pure-blooded nationals will be called citizens. That statement captures the decisive shift of the 1982 law. Citizenship ceased to be a civic status tied to residence and descent and became primarily contingent on racial categorization. Section 4.2 of the 1948 Union Citizenship Act had provided that any person would be deemed a citizen if their ancestors had for at least 2 generations made a territory of the Union their permanent home and both the person and their parents were born there. Reflecting the insignificance of race, national registration cards did not identify the cardholder's race. By contrast, the 1982 law anchored citizenship in national races, identifying citizen persons belonging to 8 ethnic groups that were later divided by military instruction into 135. Neither the 1982 law, the military instruction, nor any other state communication ever explained or justified Myanmar's formulation of the national races. Crucially, the Rohingya were excluded from both lists. That exclusion, coupled with the discriminatory implementation of the law, denationalized roughly 1 million Rohingya, creating, as the French representative to the UN Security Council mission to Bangladesh observed, the largest group of stateless persons in the world. History shows that utopian projects of race and nation begin with bureaucratic reclassification and lead ultimately to deprivation, expulsion, and death. As Myanmar notes, Section 6 of the 1982 law preserved existing citizens. On paper, that should have prevented mass statelessness. In practice, it did not. As Professor Cheeseman explains, registration officers apparently acting on orders from superiors refused to re-register people who were entitled to pink cards or citizenship scrutiny cards. Even university graduates and civil servants who had already had to pass through numerous background checks were denied the cards. The UN fact-finding mission identifies wide administrative discretion that enabled discriminatory and arbitrary implementation, such as provisions permitting those enforcing the law to act without providing reasons for their decisions. Even Myanmar's own Advisory Commission on Rakhine State reported in 2017 that out of roughly 1 million stateless Muslims in Rakhine State, only about 4,000 were recognized as citizens or naturalized citizens. Thus, over 99% were denied even associate or nationalized citizenship. This bureaucratic assault was accompanied by violence. In 1978, Operation Nagamin, or Dragon King, ostensibly a registration exercise ahead of a census, saw military assaults and destruction of property that led to the flight of over 200,000 Rohingya to Bangladesh. The image on the screen was taken then. Another operation, Operation Pitaya, which means clean and beautiful nation, was carried out in Rakhine State between 1991 and 1992. The information received by Special Rapporteur D'Almeida indicated that this operation entailed extrajudicial executions, torture, arbitrary detention, and forced disappearances, rape, forced labor, robbery, arson, eviction, land confiscation, and the destruction of mosques, forcing flight at a rate of 5,000 to 7,000 persons per day by March 1992. A subsequent report by UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali recorded over 250,000 Rohingya fleeing to neighboring Bangladesh to seek asylum. After confiscating prior national registration cards, Myanmar began issuing temporary registration cards, white cards, to members of the Rohingya in 1995. These cards expressly denied citizenship and residence rights. The cards also introduced race and religion identification, branding the Rohingya as Bengali. In 2014, Myanmar launched another verification process. White cards were exchanged with national verification cards, which emphasize that they do not evidence citizenship and that cardholders are persons who, quote, need to apply for citizenship. Although the cards themselves did not identify race, authorities compelled applicants to forswear their Rohingya identity and register as Bengali to obtain the cards, thereby conditioning access to food, healthcare, fishing licenses, and other employment on rejection of their Rohingya identity. Myanmar also pursued policies aimed at suppressing Rohingya family formation and births, deliberate demographic engineering, cloaked in administrative language. A Mangdao Regional Order from February 2008 titled Regional Order and Processes for Controlling Bengali Population justified control on, quote, extremely high population density, population increase beyond the international standards, and children who are not controlled and systematically taken care of by the parents, creating problems for the human environment. The order imposed a prior permission regime on all Islamic marriages, requiring review by various authorities and border police, as well as registration with the so-called Illegal Entry Prevention People's Group, while certain aspects of the order applied to Mangdao's non-Muslim minority, particularly onerous conditions applied uniquely to Muslims. A dedicated annex listed additional requirements solely for, quote, Bengalis who apply for permission to marry, confirming the order's discriminatory focus on Rohingya. Even where permission was granted, couples were required to limit the number of children in order to control the birth rate. The order also restricted marriage timelines, banned under-18 marriages, and criminalized relations outside wedlock. The order specified various punishments for violations of its provisions, including up to 10 years imprisonment. The order expressly justified itself as being, quote, for the good of the region and the race. The race here is, of course, to the exclusion of the Rohingya. Myanmar also attacked legal identity at its source. It denied birth certificates to Rohingya newborns. Even Myanmar concedes that birth registration of Rohingya babies came almost to a halt after the violence of 2012. In fact, as reported by the UN fact-finding mission, the UN Special Rapporteur, and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Myanmar stopped registering the Rohingya births in the 1990s. As the fact-finding mission observed, legal identity starts with a birth certificate. Denying the issuance of birth certificates to Rohingya newborns is a deliberate tool to erase the Rohingya. Finally, I turn to confinement, segregation, and deprivation. Mr. President, genocide can proceed by indirect methods of destruction. As scholars have noted in other contexts, confinement and systematic deprivation can cause death even before overt killing. In this regard, a former humanitarian worker who spent months in Rakhine State testified to the UN Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar that beyond the large-scale acts of violence against the Rohingya that made the headlines, it was the, quote, everyday systematic human rights violations that added to an unbearable pressure of Rohingya daily lives. He said he considers Myanmar's conduct tantamount to genocide because the Rohingya just simply couldn't live. Every avenue of survival was closed down around them. Myanmar does not dispute that after the 2012 riots, the Rohingya in and around Sitwe, the capital of Rakhine, were segregated into camps distinct from those housing Rakhine communities, and that until today, 13 years on, 18 Rohingya camps remain, while those of all other ethnic groups have been closed. These are not ordinary IDP camps. Given the severe deprivation of liberty imposed on camp populations, some humanitarian actors and analysts have referred to the camps as internment camps. In these open-air prisons, approximately 126,000 Rohingya are being held indefinitely. Human Rights Watch reports that the Rohingya remain in these de facto detention camps surrounded by fences, police, and military. The International Crisis Group indicates that the Rohingya there are subject to apartheid-like bans on access to hospitals and schools. And a UNICEF spokesperson testifies to the dire sanitary conditions there. I quote, "The first thing you notice when you reach the camps is the stomach-churning stench. Part of the camps are literally cesspools. Shelters teeter on stilts above garbage and excrement. One camp manager reported 4 deaths among children ages 3 to 10 within the first 18 days of December 2018. Outside the camps, Rohingya have also been forced to live separately in the Aung Mingala ghetto in Sitwe. Contrary to Myanmar's assertions of freedom of movement there, independent parties such as Médecins Sans Frontières report that for over a decade, Rohingya have been confined to this small neighborhood, denied freedom to move, with police outposts guarding it day and night. The UN fact-finding mission also stressed that in Aung Mingala, the Rohingya are trapped and guarded by armed police, checkpoints, and barbed wire. When George Soros, founder of Open Society Institute, visited it in 2015, he reported as follows, I quote, "In Aung Mingala, I heard the echoes of my childhood. You see, in 1944, as a Jew in Budapest, I too was a Rohingya. Much like the Jewish ghetto set up by Nazis around Eastern Europe during World War II, Aung Mingala has become the involuntary home to thousands of families who once had access to healthcare, education, and employment. Now they are forced to remain segregated in a state of abject deprivation." The Rohingya who are not confined in camps or ghettos are subject to severe movement restrictions that confine them to their villages and surrounding areas. The UN fact-finding mission describes a layered system of written and unwritten rules enforced through village and township-level curfews, permits, and numerous security checkpoints administered arbitrarily and conditioned on bribes. To travel between townships, Rohingya must obtain temporary Form 4 permits, departure certificates from their village administrators. The UN mission records that by August 2017, there were more than 160 checkpoints in northern Rakhine, where Rohingya were uniquely subjected to questioning, extortion, and intimidation, unlike ethnic Rakhine. The Rohingya in Rakhine State had long sustained themselves through fishing, farming, and trading, but since 2012, curfews have curtailed early morning and night fishing. Fishermen are required to pay checkpoint fees and surrender part of their catch, and those found on the quote-unquote wrong area risk ill treatment, arrest, and violence. The UN mission finds that Myanmar's movement restrictions and specific limitations on access to fishing grounds, agricultural lands, and forests impede access to food and livelihood. Myanmar's harm on humanitarian access exacerbate these harms. The UN mission documents that access to Mangdao, Butidang, and Ratadang were severely restricted after the 2012 violence, and again in mid-2017 prior to the August 2017 clearance operations. In one example, Myanmar chose to revoke the travel and activity permissions of all humanitarian agencies assisting the Rohingya in Rakhine State in 2017, simply because the World Food Programme had published a report about malnutrition in Rakhine, pointing out that virtually no Rohingya children under age 2 met minimum diet requirements. A former humanitarian worker of Action contre la Faim, who was operating in Rakhine State at that time, reflected that, quote, "It was a cruel irony that a report exposing malnutrition was used to sever the vital lifeline of humanitarian aid. I recall the ACF nutrition team leader, Laura, saying in no uncertain terms that this decision would have immediate consequences. Children would die because our aid was being cut off." Discriminatory movement controls also translate directly into barriers to health care. The UN mission reports that restrictions on access to medical facilities have been enforced strictly, even in emergencies, such as obstructed labor, infants needing oxygen, or heart attacks. It observes that through these movement restrictions, Myanmar has exposed Rohingya to, I quote, "unnecessary suffering, immediate and long-term health risks, and preventable deaths." Members of the court, Myanmar's policies targeting the Rohingya operated in tandem with an affirmative state program to alter the demography of northern Rakhine by inviting foreign Buddhists to settle in Rohingya majority areas. The UN Independent Investigation Mechanism for Myanmar has analyzed official documents and state media showing that from 2013 to 2018, authorities encouraged Buddhist communities from Bangladesh's Chittagong Hill tracts to immigrate and settle in Rakhine State. The government's own newspaper reported that, quote, 742 households and 3,433 family members who moved from Bangladesh are being accommodated in Natala model villages and subsidized with household commodities and food for a one-year period. Not only were Buddhists from Bangladesh invited to immigrate to Rohingya majority areas in Myanmar, government agencies incentivized their resettlement by providing housing, farmland, rations, and cash, and issuing immigration permits and travel authorizations enabling free movement. Legal capacities categorically withheld to the Rohingya born and living in Myanmar. Significantly, Myanmar also placed these Buddhist migrants on an expedited path to citizenship and granted them citizenship scrutiny cards. Myanmar's enactment of these policies, while denationalizing, suppressing births, segregating, confining, and depriving the Rohingya of access to food, healthcare, and livelihood, provides further evidence of its intent to diminish and erase the Rohingya in Rakhine State. As the UN fact-finding mission observed, considered alongside the criminal acts that followed, Myanmar's discriminatory policies support the inference that it deliberately imposed conditions of life calculated to bring about the Rohingyas' destruction in whole or in part. In 1946, the Nuremberg Tribunal found that a series of discriminatory laws aimed at eliminating Jews from the German life and economy paved the way for the final solution. So too here, Myanmar's discriminatory policies paved the way for the genocidal clearance operations. Mr. President, members of the Court, this concludes my submissions. I thank you for your attention, and may I respectfully invite you to call Mr. Suleiman to the podium after the afternoon break.
I thank Ms. Pasipanodia for her statement. Before I give the floor to the next speaker, the Court will observe a break of 50 minutes. The sitting is suspended.
By call, no zaigoi, 15 minute alla break lewa, tai 15 minute alla ayo bongiri rekium, armatokulium, dora bekuneo do de takio go. 15 minute alla break le itara 15 minute alla छुट्टी ले ये 15 मिनट बाद आरमत आइबो या हो बजे अरे 11:30 बजे मिलिशिया मध्ये ओके 11:45 मिनिट मध्ये तरा आरमत लाइव शुरू होइबो तय बयान बेगुलो नरे Onomikya notaygoy morba ene call itara 15 minute alla break le idu 15 minute alla 15 minute baade ar motaibo tai ar motaile ara kunim diri ere bozono yeya notaygoy ai live bonguri phalaim to इंदा से लाइव विभाग पूरा ले आर मत मानसे साइबो दुवा इतर अल्लाह मुश्किल बोदा तल्ला लाइव कुली रखने परिबो लाइव कुली रखिले वीडियो लंबो जेबो मानसे तो साइते मुश्किल बुआ एतल्ला आई लाइव बनगुचुम तै 15 मिनट बाद आर मत कुली इंदिरी इतरा आले जियाउर रहमान भाई ओके ब्रो ओके अस्सलाम वालेकुम वालेकुम अस्सलाम Waalaikumsalam. Oke baik ya call. Ai bon guri kala ni wa. Tai 15 minit बाद यार मत कुलिम देरिया. तुम्हारा नजाए को इंतजार करी तक क्यों? आर मत कुनी बारा भानगी.